Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode here from GuigLit, your one-stop shop for all things books, beards and beyond. Today, by special request, we are going through an Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, considering every character and theme analysed in its turn. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that thumbs up, be sure to share this also with your friends and hit that bell icon for more updates. If you haven't already, GuigLit is also available on Instagram and TikTok, where you can find more hints, tips and updates. So, what would I recommend you do with this video? A number of different things. You can also use this to take notes, ask a question in the comments. The GuigLit guarantee is I will get back to you. With every question I get, I do reply. In addition, you can use this as a revision tool, alone or with classmates, as you head towards your examinations. You can use this to help produce mind maps. There's plenty of quotes as well as good analysis with each one today. And be sure to list examples as you go as a way to prepare for your examinations. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with Mr. Burling. The characters I look at today are in the order of which they appear in the line of questioning by the inspector. So what can I say about Mr. Burling? Well, first of all, I like to go with first descriptions now and then, and I think his is quite important. He's described as a rather portentous man, provincial in his speech. He's also described as being sat at one end of the table. Now you'll notice from the screen you see here, I've highlighted the key kind of words being described as portentous, but also provincial. Mr. Burling comes across and is presented as a character who, despite his rather aloof nature, this idea of him being more superior than others, he actually comes from quite humble origins. The provincial nature of his speech shows he isn't naturally of the upper middle class. He's someone who's had to climb his way there, and there's an irony to the way he then treats workers as a result. Equally, the stage directions denote how he is at one end of the table. Now, this is a hard thing to kind of understand in a modern context, but if we take this back to the time in which it was set, this demonstrates that he is the head of the table. He is the person in charge. He is the person to which all the other characters respect and admire, or at least are supposed to. In addition, his first quote is "Giving us the port, Edna." That's right. So it's interesting how he starts off with his first quote as talking to a maid, or their maid more specifically. Also, interesting use there of the port as a form of alcohol. This has got connotations of being of the wealthy, more privileged class, and it wouldn't be a common thing people would drink. It was certainly something for a special occasion as this is, and it's certainly something that demonstrates Mr. Burling's wealth. As well as this, he is presented as greedy. For quite famous quote of his is "for lower costs and higher prices." He does this as part of a toast and a speech. What we see here is Mr. Burling as a capitalist, but most specifically as a capitalist who is desiring to exploit the people who work for him. He's solely and principally interested in making more money, as we see there the idea of costs and prices. Mr. Burling's also described as ignorant. There's a quote here earlier on in Act 1 where he's described as saying there will be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere. Now notice there I've emboldened the letter P in each instance. This demonstrates how he believes that the future, remember Priestley writes this just after the Second World War, is going to be one of growth for all of them as privileged individuals, when the reality, as Priestley knew it, isn't the case. So the alliterative use of peace, prosperity, progress combines all these ideas and just reasserts how ignorant and ill-timed they actually are shown in the light of day. Notice it also says everywhere, as if Mr. Burling believes that growth is something that will be enjoyed by everyone, despite the fact it patently isn't then, nor was it after the Second World War. He's also described as self-centred, or presented as self-centred. When the inspector is questioning him, he says how he can't accept any responsibility. Note there, I always think a really good thing with quotes is the ability to take a quote and then dig them, as I call them, hence all the highlighted yellow words. I can't accept any responsibility. Notice he completely wipes his hands of the whole affair regarding Eva Smith, and it's important to have as a factor there. Then we move on to Sheila Berling, the second character who is analysed as a consequence of this. And with Eva Smith, she will be analysed as we go through this, as you'll see, as she is kind of not only the victim, she has no lines herself, but we'll see this with Sheila. So, the first description of Sheila is as a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited. Notice here how it's her physical description that is actually comes across firstly by Priestley, that she is pretty, that she's very pleased with life and rather excited. This is going to be a quite interesting point to make, because we see that she actually grows quite a lot throughout the development of the play. And she starts as someone who's quite childlike and ignorant, and quite content to be ignorant and happy in her own little way. Her first quote is, "I should jolly well think not, Gerald. I'd hate you to know all about port." Now, why have I picked this out? Jolly well, we see this use of a kind of slang, a colloquialism, for want of a better term, a phrase that would have been used by the Edwardian upper middle classes as we have here, but she's also directly talking to her future fiancé. So her conversation and what she has to say is directly linked to what the men have to say. Her opinion is based solely on the male conversation at this point in the play. Shows her as kind of a subordinate secondary character, but in my opinion, she certainly grows as the play progresses. She seemed to have quite a sheltered life. Notice, despite her being in her early 20s, she's referring to her mother as mummy. It shows her as quite childlike and quite sheltered from the realities of the world. She hasn't grown or developed an awful lot. In addition, we see that she's being, in a kind of sense, controlled. So when Gerald produces the ring, she says, "Oh, Gerald, is this the one you wanted me to have?" Notice the use of pronouns here, the one you wanted me to have. She's had no say or actual opinion in her wedding ring, or engagement ring rather, and it's her husband's choice, showing again her lack of actual agency, her lack of actual presence at the start of the play. However, Sheila, like her brother, as we'll get onto later, changes an awful lot as we go on. For example, when the inspector begins to talk about Eva Smith and she's there, she says, "I wish you hadn't told me." Then this becomes, "So I'm really responsible," and then ends up coming, "I can't stop thinking about it," as it goes on. So she goes from a place of willful ignorance. She wishes she hadn't heard anything about the incident regarding Eva Smith, to taking on and self-reflecting about the idea that she has responsibility in this, ultimately to the fact that she can't stop thinking about the fate that has befallen Eva. So really dramatic, quite clear change from her as the play progresses. She also changes towards Gerald when Gerald reveals his relationship with Daisy Renton. She says, "You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here." And then she hands him the ring. Notice she, in stage directions, passes it back, like she takes control, she takes ownership of the event itself. It's just worthy of knowing there. Just noticing how she changes towards him. That change is also consolidated, and she doesn't take him back fully at the end of the play. Lastly, we see how she sets herself apart from the others at the end. One of her last quotes is, "You knew it then, you began to learn something, and now you've stopped." That repetition of you combined with you've, that pronoun, she's clearly defining herself as different from those around her, and how she has given and taken on board a lasting impression of the events, despite what her parents in particular, and to a lesser extent Gerald, have taken with it. Moving on now, we now look at the third character question by the inspector, Gerald Croft. Gerald Croft's a really interesting one, because his first description shows him as being about 30, so he's clearly older than his soon-to-be fiancée Sheila, but he's also the well-bred young man about town. He kind of lives within two worlds, Gerald. We see this in his first quote. "The governor prides himself on being a good judge of port." First of all, the governor, it demonstrates how Gerald is very much connected to the adult world, how he is associating with people that Mr. Burling would, but also he has an opinion to be had to a degree on the choice, the rather wealthy choice of alcohol at this point in the play. We see how he conforms to the older generational expectations as well. He says, "I insist upon being one of the family now. I've been trying long enough, haven't I?" Notice how he wants to assimilate. He wants to be part of the dreams and desires of the Burlings, particularly what the parental figures have to say. He also comes from wealth. Mr. Burling says how your mother feels you might have done better for yourself socially. Gerald is marrying into an extent beneath him. He comes from even greater wealth than the Burling family has, and that's an important point to note, that he's very much from a wealthy background. In addition, we do see again how he is between generations. You know him, Gerald, and you're a man. You must know this isn't true. Now, Mrs. Burling says this to him when they're referring to Eric. See how Mrs. Burling here is relying upon Gerald for some confirmation or hope or help on Eric's real life flaws. But Gerald can't provide them, so he has not only the experience and knowledge of the younger generation, but he is trusted and confided in by the older generation. So he really is that character that goes down the middle of the pairs. His final quote, however, shows, "Everything's all right now, Sheila." Pay close attention to that word, everything. He's demonstrating here that he, like Mr. and Mrs. Burling, have completely rid themselves of their responsibilities towards the actual circumstances themselves. Moving on now to Mrs. Burling, the penultimate character to be questioned. We see here a number of things that are quite important about her. So Mrs. Burling's first description is as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. Two things here, the adjective cold, demonstrating how she's not somebody who can be easily warm or empathetic, as we'll soon see. She's quite a cruel character in many regards, in fact, but also her husband's social superior. She has married beneath herself in marrying her husband, so she too comes from generational or certainly inherited wealth. Her first quote is, "All right, Edna, I'll ring from the drawing room when we want coffee." Notice, like her husband, her first quote is towards a servant, towards someone working for them, demonstrating the level of control they have, but also, "I'll ring from the drawing room." So she is demonstrating how not only is she in control, but also this element here of talking to those in their employ. She's very much like her husband in that regard in her first quote. The additional point here we have about her is that she's set in her ways. She's very traditional. She says, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things" in Act 1. And to her daughter, she says, "You'll have to get used to that," in reference to Gerald Croft and his work habits. Firstly, let's take the idea of not supposed to say such things. Mrs. Burling very much conforms to the etiquette of the time, that you are only meant to have such conversations around a dinner table. So she's very much the old world, as Priestley is demonstrating here. So too is this quote, "You'll have to get used to that." There's a kind of thinly veiled critique here of women's expectations, as the mother, in this case Mrs. Burling, tells her daughter Sheila to accept and conform to standards that she wouldn't necessarily wish to, particularly when she finds out more about Gerald. Now later on, we see her as naive. Notice how she enters briskly and self-confidently, quite out of key with the little scene that has just passed. That line there that I've highlighted, "out of key," that phrase rather, is really quite telling when she re-enters the room after the inspector's interrogations. We see how she is completely removed from the mood and tone and the atmosphere of the piece, and how it doesn't affect her whatsoever. Later on, we see her as entirely dismissive. She describes the Eva Smith incident as absurd business, and how her daughter is behaving, quote, "like a hysterical little child," which chimes in well with the quote I made earlier and the point about Sheila herself. She's also seen as snobbish. When referring to Eva Smith and her plight, she talks about girls of that class. Notice this dismissive tone, almost borderline contemptuous, of how Mrs. Burling sees working class women. And her final quote is quite interesting as well. "In the morning they," in reference to Sheila and Eric, "will be as amused as we are." There's that choice of word there, amused, as if the whole thing is one big elaborate hoax or prank that the characters have been drawn into, instead of a real important issue or matter. Then we get to the final character who is interrogated, Eric Burling. Now with Eric, his first description is quite poignant. He's described as being downstage. This reinforces his inferiority socially and how he's very much the little child at the start of this. He's set apart from the family at the dinner table. He's put in such a way that puts him further and lower down the proverbial pecking order. Eric Burling also is described as not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. The repetition of half there, demonstrating this is a character who's deeply conflicted in many regards, as the play will demonstrate. His first quote is also quite poignant, the stage direction of how he guffaws. There's quite a kind of foolish element to this, that he guffaws, breaks the mood and the tone that is trying to be established here by Mr. Burling, while at the same time demonstrates his immaturity that becomes clear later on. Eric is also dismissed by his parents. They say how he has a lot to learn yet. That phrase there, "a lot to learn," is showing Mr. Burling particularly the man who says that, how Eric is so childlike and how Eric doesn't kind of understand the world in the way his father certainly wants him to. We also see him, like his sister, being controlled or infantilized. There's a quote here where it says, Eric seems to be in an excitable, silly mood. That tone there is kind of suggesting it's almost talking to a much younger child rather than a young adult. And the quote later on, which says, you've had enough of that port, Eric, where they're trying to control his drinking habits. However, one thing I think that's often quite ignored, not only the fact that he empathizes and he's actually very socially aware, it isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else in Act 1 towards his father, he is able to put himself in the shoes of the plight of the character of Eva Smith. But there's also a number of stage directions which demonstrate him as one of the more emotional characters, if not the most emotional character in the play. We see how he's bursting out. We see how he acts defiantly. A lot of the stage directions, remember, they are quotes too, and they are accessible and rewardable and awardable. We see how here Eric is very much a character who is fragmented and kind of frayed, and we see that through the stage directions, how his emotions seep out. His final line is, and I agree with Sheila. So here Burling and the Burling family are very divided, and he says, I agree with Sheila. The children and the children's generation are set apart from the adult generation at the very end. So now what we're going to look at is Inspector Gould and how he is presented as a character, which is really important. First of all, if you don't know already, notice the poignancy of his name, Gould, and the kind of play on words of a ghoul, as in a ghost, kind of already gives us a nod or a hint, an allusion to the fact he may not be entirely real in one way or another. However, his first reference actually comes earlier on in the stage directions from Priestley. Priestley describes how the lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives. So we already know from the stage directions that the inspector is going to have a massive impact and significant role to play, not only in the events of the play, but in the mood, tone and atmosphere, that he will literally shift the staging as a consequence. His first actual description, he's described as creating at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. Notice this one, not only this list, how he's quite an important, significant, statuesque figure, but it happens at once. It happens immediately, which is quite telling to have. His first quote is, no thank you, Mr. Burling, I'm on duty. We see how he is cold, almost dispassionate, and isn't going to be brought into the whims and fancies of the Burling family. He's there a man on a job, on a role, a mission. He's also very emotive and blunt. He describes in quite graphic detail how Eva Smith burnt her insides out, of course. The disinfectant burnt her inside out. He really deliberately goes to the emotional appeal there that's drawn in on some of the characters. We also have him as understanding and empathetic. He says it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women. Notice these shifts of words, us all, we, ourselves. Inspector Gould is trying to conjure up this idea of community responsibility and sympathy towards people in plights and less fortunate positions to get the Burlings, particularly the older generation, to register this sense of empathy. So he's really trying to bring this across. We also see him as moral. He describes how men have responsibilities as well as privileges, that one comes with the other. A very important point to note there from the inspector himself. He's also very much unfazed by wealth. He rejects the offer of the poor. He says how he's losing patience with all you people. Okay, see how he's very much not of their class, all you people. He defines himself as different to them, and he's not intimidated by Mr. Burling's threats at all. He's also the moral voice of the play. One of his final quotes is how we are all members of one body. Notice the we, the all. He's trying to get this effect here at the end that they're all together in this and that society is only as great as its weakest, less fortunate parts. So now we turn our attention to what I see as some of the key themes of the play. I'll provide key quotes with each one, but I just want to talk through them as we go. So let's start with responsibility. Eva really is a metaphor for the responsibility society shares towards others. Whether Eva Smith was real or not kind of isn't the point of the play, because Eva Smith, as noticed by her name Eva, like Eve, the first woman as per the Bible, she is a figurative character. She never says her own words. She is a metaphor for how society should treat one another. We see a clear divide between generations in this theme of responsibility, as well as other themes we'll see later. We see how Gerald also lies in the middle of this, the inspector acting as a mirror on the theme of responsibility and showing the characters how they are responsible for others as well. When his presence is questioned, however, and Gerald brings to light the possible faults in the inspector and who he is, we see the older characters revert back to ignorance and wash their hands of the situation. So some key quotes I quite like here. There's this one from the end by Inspector Gould where he says, "But remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us." Notice this, he uses the imperative, remember this. He's commanding the characters to remember, not just the characters, but the audience watching at the time as well. One Eva Smith has gone, but millions and millions and millions. This list demonstrating that Eva Smith isn't just one person in many ways, she's many people. And then the name John Smith as well is still used. Eva Smiths and John Smiths, a deliberately generic English name, kind of comes across here. If men will not learn that lesson, then they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. The final words of the inspector. Notice that list as well. Fire, blood, anguish. A warning of how the world will end or the world will go to if people don't learn this idea of responsibility. A real warning message that Priestley is trying to tell us as an audience. And these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. There's an interesting comparison there. This idea of them being humans, this responsibility really comes through in the younger generations in a way it certainly doesn't with the older ones. Moving on now, we're looking at the generational divide. And if you haven't already noticed, the generational divide is rather significant in this play. It's sharply different sets of opinions and standards then happen between the older and younger characters as a result. Gerald, once again, is the middle point of these two. While he does show responsibility on some occasions, towards the end of the play, he actually sides with the parents and really consolidates the standards and the kind of status quo of the time. Now, the older generation are shown to be ignorant, they're shown to be naive, and ultimately wrong. Remember, the play is first performed in 1945, despite it being set over 30 years before. So when Mr. Burling's talking about World War I or the Titanic, we see him as a rather naive character for what he said. So some key quotes I'd just like to give you here. The point is, you don't seem to have learnt anything. Notice that idea of anything. What Sheila is saying here is that she notices in the older generation that they, you, both Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and to a degree Gerald, are not taking on any lessons from the inspector whatsoever because they're more concerned with whether he's real or not. In addition, we often do on the young ones, they're more impressionable. An important quote there from the inspector, showing how the younger generation are more feeling, more empathetic, more understanding in an important way. And community and all that nonsense. A really important quote there describing how the older generation simply do not care or do not notice how important it is. Now I want to talk about the theme of gender and how gender is really important here in this play. Again, there are clear societal expectations of young women in particular, seen in Sheila and her engagement, how she's to dress, how she's to act, how people are supposed to act, particularly if they're women. However, the look of gender expectations, whether that's men or women, the veneer as I've called it, is undermined by the inspector. In his interrogations and his inquiries, the inspector shows that whether it's a man or a woman, humanity can be selfish, cruel and exploitative towards those of a lower class. Some key quotes that demonstrate this, for example, this one from Mr. Burling where he describes women and dresses as a sort of sign or token of their self-respect, this kind of ignorant, dismissive manner in which he's speaking. As well as this, I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. Notice the contempt Gerald Croft has at the women he meets when he's describing how he first met Daisy Renton. So an important point there. In addition, simply absurd in a girl in her position. Said by Mrs. Burling when she's being interrogated, a girl in her position. So it's not just gender, but it's this cross-section or this intersection of gender and class. How Eva Smith is betrayed not just because she's a woman, but also because she's a working class woman, that people don't want to listen to her or treat her seriously. Certainly Mrs. Burling. Finally, I just want to talk about the theme of guilt and how guilt is very important and significant in this play. Once again, guilt is demonstrated differently between generations, whether it is the older generation of the parental figures or it is the younger generation. The older characters show almost little to no guilt whatsoever, and is sharply contrasted with Sheila and Eric. Gerald, as always, tends to fit in a divide of the two. Some key quotes here that show this. If we were all responsible for everything that happened, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? That's Mr. Burling in Act 1 when speaking to the inspector. Notice the kind of ignorant tone he says here. We were all responsible for everything. He tries to downplay his role as an industrialist and as a factory owner and making him sound like he's part of society, when really he's a very small, sharp, important point of society that is exploiting the majority of the society, in this case the people working for him. Equally, we did her in all right is said by Eric. The pronoun we, unlike his father where he tries to shift the blame and not show any responsibility, Eric uses it differently. We did her in all right. He believes the entire family is responsible for what occurred. Also, Eric, I'm absolutely ashamed of you. Notice here how, rather than showing any guilt herself, Mrs. Burling demonstrates how she actually shifts the blame onto the younger characters, particularly Eric. Notice how she mentions being ashamed of him rather than in any way, shape or form herself. Hope that was very useful for you all. Thank you as always for watching and tuning in. Be sure to like, share and subscribe. We are available on TikTok and Instagram. Do be sure to search GuigLit, drop a comment if you have any questions. And until next time, take care, all the very best, and bye-bye.